Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabarty. Today is Wednesday, May 29th, and we have some playoff action to dive into from last night. We saw the Minnesota Timberwolves fight off elimination with their backs against the wall, went into Dallas to win Game 4, and now remain alive, at least avoid the sweep. And keep their season alive for the time being. We also saw the Florida Panthers last night pull off the win in overtime. 3 straight consecutive overtime games between the New York Rangers and Florida Panthers. So we're going to be diving into that game and series as well. Then we're going to be talking about Bronny James, his decision to remain in the 2024 NBA draft, and some of the thought process behind the decision making as he has refused to work out with a number of teams, supposedly is refusing to sign a 2-way contract once he does, speak with some of these teams. So there's a whole lot to unpack there about what Bronny's future looks like. Then we are going to be talking about the Houston Texans, who signed wide receiver Nico Collins to a contract extension, just sort of looking ahead to their season and the breakdown of that deal. And then finally, we're going to be finishing off the show by sort of doing a very early look ahead towards the NFL awards for the 2024-25 season. I know we have plenty of time there, but there were some things that stood out to me from an odds perspective that I sort of wanted to dive into there. But before we get into the show today, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. To any of our live viewers, be sure to use the comment section to give us your thoughts on all the latest happenings in sports. We try and address as many comments as possible and help make this show as interactive as possible, and it takes you to do so. And if you would like to become a bigger part of the show, you can go to the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker throughout the show, currently on the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. You can leave a tip or donation with a comment. Your comment will pop up on the screen, and anything would be greatly appreciated. Starting off the show, though, going to be talking about the Minnesota Timberwolves, who were able to avoid the sweep last night with their backs against the wall. They end up winning this game 105-100. Now, before we sort of get into the bigger picture here for the Timberwolves in terms of whether or not they can come back, I think that it is definitely worth just talking about the fact that, we couldn't really expect this version of Anthony Edwards and Karl-Anthony Towns, this sort of subdued version where they were very inefficient through the majority of this series, and they finally bounced back in this game. Anthony Edwards in particular was really the driving force for them. He was their leading scorer, 29 points, came just short of a triple-double as well. And we are seeing the improved playmaking with him throughout. I think that this postseason, Anthony Edwards has never been a bad playmaker necessarily, but I do think that, this being his first deep postseason run, he is now sort of experiencing what it's like to be a star and getting that treatment through the duration of a playoff series. And we are seeing his ability to sort of navigate double teams and such take on a more and more significant role. He came out firing 14 points in the first quarter, I believe, and, it was interesting with him because he did get himself into foul trouble. That was a huge conversation really for Minnesota as a whole. There was an interesting stretch there down the final few minutes of the first half where Anthony Edwards, Karl-Anthony Towns, and Rudy Gobert all had 3 fouls, so they were having to close out with the bench unit and actually did a pretty good job in those minutes. But Edwards, part of the reason he was in foul trouble is because he was taking on the Luka Doncic assignment sort of at an enhanced rate. And we've talked about this before. There really isn't a player in the NBA that can fully shut down Luka Doncic, so there's only so much you can do. I thought Edwards' energy and his defense was good for a span there, but at the same time, you saw, especially in the second and third quarters, he was a little bit more run down, added to the fact that he was dealing with this foul trouble, and a couple of them, when he's fouling Luka at half court, listen, I understand Anthony Edwards is wired to be an extremely high motor player, and that's what he brings, and that's what we all appreciate about him, but the Timberwolves rely on him too much to have him sort of sitting on the bench, and ultimately it came back around for him late in the third quarter, early in the fourth quarter, and like I mentioned, that playmaking as well. He was the one sort of setting up Karl-Anthony Towns for those two massive threes that he hit in the fourth quarter, forced a 6-point swing, and really from that, the Timberwolves just sort of kept that 5-point lead throughout the rest of the game. Karl-Anthony Towns, it was such a typical I wouldn't say typical necessarily, but we got the full Karl-Anthony Towns experience last night, where I did think that he was really successful offensively when he wasn't doing stupid stuff, which is always sort of the caveat with Towns. Just some of the fouls with him are so infuriating because he puts himself in these compromising positions, and every time he freaks out as if it's the most outlandish thing that he gets called for those fouls. But, just about every single one of them was the right call. Now, I obviously have talked about it before. I don't love that call where for the foul that he picked up right at the end of the game with a minute and a half left that took him out for the rest of the game. He sort of lunged out at Luka Doncic. Now, Luka was definitely trying to initiate contact in this as well. So you let me know how you feel about that call in the comment section. But again, we just saw it all the way throughout the game where he was just picking up these dumb fouls. And again, the way that he looks appalled when he's called for it, it just, it drives me a little bit crazy. But it was really encouraging to see him have this bounce back game where I thought he did a great job attacking the rim, actually looked, coordinated and put together. And I don't know if the absence of Derek Lively gave him some sort of extra confidence. Now, that being said, Maxi Kleber returned for the Mavericks in this game, and he did draw a couple charges against Towns. So I'm not sure exactly what it was. Obviously, Lively a little lengthier than Kleber, so maybe that was part of it. But then it was the three-point shooting where Towns was 0 for 8 the other night, and in this game, specifically in the second half, he got himself going, didn't even attempt a three in the first half, but finished this game 4 of 5, and you see the fouls and the minutes on the screen. Again, it is frustrating with him that he puts himself in these positions that he is unable to play some of these crunch time minutes, but the Timberwolves obviously at least have a good enough backup option in Naz Reid that it's not entirely detrimental to them, and obviously they win last night, so it wasn't ultimately the biggest deal in the world. But Towns, I just thought it was such a prototypical what you sort of get in terms of the roller coaster from him. And sort of, on the Mavericks side of this series, or of this game, I don't think that there was really all too much that you can say in terms of, instead of, you can't manufacture, importance and, what's the word I'm looking for? More so motivation. And I think that for the Mavericks being up 3-0, it was just a lot easier for the Timberwolves to sort of get up for this game. And Anthony Edwards, like I mentioned, he came out flying early. And ultimately, you just got some off nights from Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving, where they both shot 33% from the field and struggled from the three-point line. Now, Draymond Green on the TNT show was talking about how he thought that there was something for the Timberwolves to build off of in terms of the Kyle Anderson minutes and having him be the primary for Luka. I don't necessarily know about that. I mean, I thought that Luka pretty much all the second half was doing a really good job of sort of beating Kyle Anderson on that initial dribble, getting him getting Anderson behind him on his hip and sort of just surveying the field from there. Ultimately, you know, some shots that you wish went down for the Mavericks. This would not be a panic mode situation to me whatsoever. Now, it's interesting as this series moves on here where it is going back to Minnesota for Game 5, and you would think that the Timberwolves aren't going to lose all 3 of their games at home, considering how amped up that fan base has been during this postseason run. But at the same time, you know, I do think that the Mavericks are an extremely tough mismatch for the Timberwolves. It sounds like Dereck Lively is headed towards being available to come back moving forward here. I do think that he is a very important piece of this. You know, Daniel Gafford had a nice game for himself. He was all over the place to begin that third quarter in terms of just being that lob threat. But it's clear that Kleber still isn't 100% healthy, and he's somebody that if the Mavericks are to advance to the finals, I think could get some more significant minutes and more impactful when he's actually on the court. But it was definitely clear there was a hesitancy with him trying to shoot. That's one of his main assets, is the fact that he is the big option for them that can space out the floor more, and he didn't seem comfortable with the idea of, he had some open looks that he passed up on. Now he ends up taking a couple shots in this game, but ultimately you know, he goes 0 for 2 on the 3-point looks, and again, I just don't think that that was his priority coming into this game, and obviously dealing with a dislocated shoulder for a good reason. There was also one point as well in the third quarter, I think it was, where there was a loose ball sort of around the half court, and you could just see him sort of really scared to dive down for that loose ball. And that being said, you know, he took the couple charges against Towns, so overall, you know, he was active, setting screens for the Dallas ball handlers. I think that he'll be fine in the long run, but I do think that the, you know, Dereck Lively piece of this is very important, specifically for this matchup in particular against the Timberwolves. But again, Game 5 going back to Minnesota, I do think the Wolves have a good chance of making this series a little bit more competitive. I definitely wouldn't be putting all my stock into the Timberwolves being the first team to come back down 0-3, but there is sort of an irrational confidence with Anthony Edwards that he is probably one of the, you know, more qualified leaders to potentially lead this type of a run, just off of a little bit of arrogance as well. And I say that in a good way, because he's just sort of, you know, too young to, you know, really be looking at the full history of everything. And I do think that there's a level of desperation from Rudy Gobert, obviously has been sort of dragged through the mud through these past couple rounds to some degree. And Mike Conley, their, you know, other leader, maybe a little bit more quiet in terms of the, you know, what we hear from a national media perspective, but within that locker room, Mike Conley is the one, and he's been very vocal with the team in terms of, you never know when you're going to get these types of opportunities moving forward. So, going to be interesting to see. I definitely wouldn't consider Game 5 a must-win for the Mavericks, but the longer this series goes on, obviously the more pressure that comes on to the Mavericks, and they're a team that, you know, dealing with whatever extent of the Lively injury, trying to work Maxi Kleber back in more, and we've seen Luka Doncic dealing with all these injuries throughout the course of the year, that I sort of feel like the Mavericks want to wrap this series up as soon as possible. And, you know, that's sort of common sense, but just sort of also taking into consideration some of the injury factors with this Mavericks team, while you see the Celtics on the other end of the bracket where they are sort of resting up right now, trying to get Kristaps Porzingis back and fully healthy. The Mavericks want to make sure that that rest period can be as even as possible. As we have a comment from Lil Fettuccini, can the Timberwolves rally back to tie it 3-3? I mean, if you're the Timberwolves right now, you got to be taking it one game at a time. It obviously starts with Game 5. That game is going to be tomorrow night, Thursday night. Having that series at home, if you are going to build up some type of a significant momentum to get this thing going, then it starts there. Again, I do kind of feel like, I don't know if the Timberwolves did anything different necessarily to throw off Luka and Kyrie. I kind of just felt like it was off nights for them. And again, you can't manufacture desperation. The Timberwolves were definitely playing like it. Sometimes I do think sort of to their own undoing, getting a little bit too excited and putting themselves in foul trouble. But the Timberwolves, you know, Anthony Edwards and Karl-Anthony Towns, like I mentioned, they were really struggling during the first few games of this series. Edwards, you know, better off than Towns was through the first few games, and I thought that specifically that third quarter of Game 3 for Edwards seemed like he was going to lead the comeback win there, and it stinks for them that they let that one sort of slip away. Also, you know, looking back at Game 2 as well, getting that Naz Reid situation, but they've played the Mavericks close in every one of these losses as well, so you know, last night it was the Timberwolves building up enough of a cushion that they can sort of make these mistakes at times. The Anthony Edwards foul, by the way, against Luka with just, you know, 30 or so seconds left, where Luka ends up missing the free throw to make it potentially a 2-point game. But again, those sort of youth mistakes that the Timberwolves are not necessarily fully past at this point. As much as the youth is a positive for them, a lot of the times we see them make some of these errors at times, and last night it didn't cost them, and that's why the ball don't lie, as Lil Fettuccine says. I think that Edwards one was, I can't necessarily defend that. Again, if you want to go a couple possessions earlier where Towns fouled Luka, again, I don't think that it was this massive miscarriage of justice that Towns did pick up that foul. I just don't enjoy that type of a move from Luka where he fully knew what he was doing, trying to draw the foul from Towns, sort of initiating that contact. Towns stepped up and got a little bit in the landing area, but at the same time, you can make the argument his hands were straight up, he was leaning back, and, you know, ultimately, the Timberwolves, they are too good of a team to get swept. So, to your point, ball don't lie. I think that, you know, the series ultimately kind of should be in this position. Again, the Timberwolves absolutely could have won some of these earlier games, but the late game execution of the Mavericks has been considerably better up to this point. So I think that ultimately the landing spot here of the Mavericks being up 3-1 feels right. And, you know, I think that the Mavericks, or the Timberwolves, again, can make this interesting and extend this series a little bit longer than a lot of people gave them credit for. But, you know, this does feel like the Mavericks, in one of these situations, given how much better their crunch time offense has been to the Timberwolves, that they are going to be able to win one of these next, 3 games that it is. So let me know how you feel about this series moving forward in the comments section. We're going to be taking our first break, though, and we're actually going to be calling a little bit of an audible on the fly here. I think that I want to dive into the Bronny James draft decision up next, and then we're going to get into the NHL series as well, but sort of stick basketball while we are on the topic. So we're going to be diving into that whole Bronny James conversation, but first, a quick break, and we will be right back. Stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. some moosey shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Just finished up talking about the Game 4 matchup between the Timberwolves and Mavericks. I want to move on now, though, to the news that is breaking about Bronny James. He will remain in the 2024 draft. It was expected that this would be the case. Bronny was somebody who didn't have necessarily a very accomplished, you could say, college career, but there is at least enough sort of generated interest in him at the pro level, of course being LeBron James's son, that has led, it seems like, Bronny and Rich Paul, his agent, of Clutch Sports, of course, same representative of LeBron James, to believe that there is at least enough interest that Bronny can land some type of guaranteed deal in the NBA. So, you know, like I mentioned, Rich Paul, he informed ESPN that Bronny will be remaining in the draft. The deadline for whether prospects are going to hold on to their college eligibility or not expires on Wednesday night tonight. So, sounds like Bronny is staying with it. And like I mentioned, pretty underwhelming freshman season at USC, where not all to his fault, obviously dealt with the cardiac arrest in the summertime last year that definitely derailed his usual schedule. He wasn't able to make his debut until, mid-December. So through 25 games with USC, he's averaged 4.8 points per game, 2.1 assists per game, 2.8 rebounds per game, and shot 37-27 shooting splits in 19.3 minutes per game. Now, he has been medically cleared by the NBA's fitness to play panel. So ideally, that heart is not going to be an issue for him moving forward. During the pre-draft process, it seemed like his stock took a little bit of a boost, where he was able to show off some of his athletic tools. He had a 40.5-inch standing vertical that impressed a lot of scouts. And obviously, when you're talking about the bloodline of LeBron James, you would imagine that no, Bronny definitely does not have the size of a LeBron, but there is some athletic element to his game that could potentially find its way sort of fitting in an NBA environment. Now, it's sort of whether or not the skill set is ready, as we have a comment from Lil Fettuccini about how he thinks Bronny should have stayed in college basketball another year. I know that selfishly, I would have preferred to see him get another run in college basketball. It feels like wherever he ends up, playing time is going to be at a minimum for him. And I would have really liked to see him be able to sort of run the show for himself, because a lot of people are trying to project him as a 2. Now, he showed off an ability to extend his range a little bit during this pre-draft process that some people are saying he can sort of fit in as a modern 2 with some ball handling upside. I don't know about that necessarily, because of the fact that he is just 6 feet tall, 6'1". Was in that range, flat-footed. So I don't know if I necessarily see him being able to be an incredibly impactful player off the ball on offense. Now, it's definitely possible, again, with a motor and with energy. I sort of look to Peyton Pritchard of the Boston Celtics, where somebody who is very small and can definitely be taken advantage of on defense, but he does have that motor, and especially he's one of the best offensive rebounders, at least at his size, given for whatever that is. But I think that ultimately Bronny, there is still a lot to work on in his game moving forward here. But what I found really interesting, I've sort of documented my thoughts on, I think that he does need another year of sort of having the experience of being an on-the-ball player before making the jump to the NBA, but he's committed to this at this point, and that's not a massive surprise. Once again, the reports have sort of told us that we were headed in this direction, but I think that it's very interesting the way that he and Rich Paul have sort of gone about this process in terms of how he is going to sort of negotiate with other teams, where he is reportedly skipping out on a number of different workouts with different organizations that have interest in him. Shams Charania of The Athletic reported on Tuesday that Bronny has over 10 workout invites, but, quote, he's only going to visit a couple of those, and that's going to include the Lakers and the Phoenix Suns. He already attended a pro day workout for the Lakers, but he is almost sort of limiting himself in terms of the number of landing spots. And, you know, you can make the comparison. Stephon Castle is doing a similar thing. Castle, for those of you who aren't aware, he was at UConn. He was sort of the, I don't know, call him a 2/3. He believes that he is going to be a point guard, so part of his draft process so far has been not working out for teams that already have an established point guard, because he sees himself as that moving forward. But regardless, you know, he has these defensive tools and he has size, and I really like his ability to play make off of drives, actually, in terms of the conversation of whether or not he's a point guard. But he already has sort of this lottery pedigree around him, not to mention the fact that, you know, even being just the fact that he was a contributing player with upside on a championship UConn team, a dominant team. And Bronny, again, you know, not that I don't think he should deserve any type of opportunity, but he didn't necessarily earn it through any sort of his play during his college career, where he was a backup point guard on a team that struggled to even go 500 in a power conference. So, again, really interesting draft strategies here for Bronny and his team. Now, if you want to briefly look here at the draft capital for both the Lakers and Suns, I have tried to do some research into it. The Lakers could potentially have the 17th overall pick in the first round. The Pelicans have the right to take that from them, either in this year's draft or next year's. I'm not sure if there's been an exact conclusion. I know that the deadline for the Pelicans to decide whether or not they want to is June 1st. So if anybody has information in the comment section, definitely feel free to sort of correct me here. But I feel like the Pelicans would probably try and defer that pick to next year, where there seems to be more depth in the draft. But either way, you know, so the Lakers possibly have the 17th overall pick, but if the Pelicans do take control of that, the only other pick they have is number 55 overall, right at the end of the second round. So just about every team would have a chance to draft him before the Lakers do in that second round. So, I mean, I don't know. Ultimately, are any of these other teams even going to want to take a swing at Bronny? There's so much unknown with him. I can't imagine he's going to be a first-round pick, but for him to be turning down all of these different prospects is definitely an interesting strategy. The other team that we mentioned that he's planning on working out for is the Phoenix Suns. They have the 22nd overall pick in the first round, and that's it. For the Suns, they don't really have any other assets to potentially move around in the draft unless they wanted to trade down possibly from 22 and acquire some other assets. I don't know how much the price would be in this draft in particular to get a first-round pick, late first-round pick to be exact. But, you know, interesting sort of conversation there with the Suns. Obviously, a lot of people are linking, well, if LeBron James is going to follow wherever Bronny is, there was just a report that came out just before we went live here that LeBron is expected to decline his player option, but it sounds like in hopes of restructuring a new deal with the Lakers. I don't think he's going to leave the Lakers, but obviously the conversation as well with drafting Bronny is the idea of potentially getting LeBron James as well, which is why I don't think that the prospect of Bronny is worth, you know, anywhere near a lottery pick. Now, if you are, I don't know, let's say a Thunder and you have all of these draft picks and you can afford to sort of blow one away on the upside of getting a LeBron James. And I'm sure Thunder fans would probably want LeBron James if they had the opportunity to, but they already do obviously have their core set up in place and are sort of on this more long-term timeline, but can also compete now. So it's going to be interesting to see how they operate. But anyways, all of this to be said, I think that it is sort of a stretch that any team would use an actual valuable first-round pick on Bronny, and especially because, LeBron, he has at least put it out into the world that his first priority isn't still playing with Bronny right now. Now, I'm sure before he retires he would like to, but I definitely wouldn't sort of roll the dice if you are a team that has needs and has prospects available of just trying to get Bronny. Now, I also think when you talk about the Suns conversation with this, I mean, they would have to sign LeBron James to a veteran minimum, and I don't think LeBron is going to be willing to do that, especially not this year. I think he's going to want at least one more big payday. And that's where the Suns, they have plenty of holes that I don't think it would be worth them sort of rolling the dice on this 22nd overall pick, where I saw a mock draft earlier today where Yves Missi, the center out of Baylor, who I actually liked during the year and I think that he has some upside, I would probably just try and take a swing at somebody who can actually help them compete, because the Suns are already so all in, and I just don't think LeBron is going to sign a veteran minimum anywhere. But ultimately, for Bronny in this whole conversation, it sounds like, from what Rich Paul has told ESPN and other teams, that the priority for them, from Bronny's perspective, is to get a developmental path for him. Quote, the team's strategy, the opportunity, and the financial commitment. That's why I'm not doing a two-way deal. Every team understands that, which kind of interesting, the idea of this player who could, in reality go undrafted if he wasn't LeBron James' son. I think probably would go undrafted, maybe a late second round pick, but for, that profile of a player to say, I need a guaranteed deal or I'm not playing for you, more times than not, that would mean, okay, well, you're not playing for us. But obviously, having that name to sort of back him up is something that, listen, and for everybody who's talking about nepotism and that it isn't fair, it is absolutely nepotism, but it's also just the reality that life isn't fair a lot of the times, and these are just, sports aren't removed from the everyday sort of happenings for your average citizen, where connections and family matters and such all matter. So I understand that you feel like other players should have more of an opportunity. I know that some people have talked about the idea that Mark Sears, guard for Alabama, could go undrafted, and he's an incredibly accomplished offensive player who also sort of has concerns with his size and such and how it's going to translate to the NBA. But the idea that he could potentially go undrafted, and that Bronny, who again hasn't really accomplished anything, could be drafted, I understand the complaints, but at the same time, life is just always going to work that way. But the idea of this whole denying the two-way contract thing and everything, definitely a very bold strategy for them, but it feels like that means there's probably some amount of certainty from his camp that he can get somebody to pay out a guaranteed contract, whether it's the Lakers or somebody else. In terms of best fits for him, I don't think he's going to be getting playing time in his rookie season, maybe not in his sophomore year. It's possible, maybe not ever. Which is just the reality of the situation. Not that I'm trying to, tear apart this 19-year-old kid that does probably have some sort of upside just based off of the genetics and everything and some aspects of his profile. But, I don't think that best fits for Bronny necessarily means anything just yet, because we got to actually make sure that he's an NBA player first. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. It is a very interesting conversation here with how all of this is playing out, and we will continue to monitor it as we get closer to the NBA draft in June. But that is all we have time for on this subject matter. We're going to be taking our second break here, and when we come back on the other side, I want to dive into some of the NHL playoff action from last night, where we saw the Florida Panthers even up their series against the New York Rangers. So stick with us, and we will be right back after this quick break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube. Absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're headed into our third segment here, where I want to talk about the NHL playoff game from last night, where the Florida Panthers evened up their series against the New York Rangers with an overtime win. The third straight game in this series that has gone to overtime. It's been massively entertaining up to this point, and the Panthers had dropped the previous two but bounced back with this one, and they were able to pull it out thanks to their power play unit, which had been struggling through the first part of this series, but last night they convert twice, including the overtime game-winning goal, where earlier in the game, in the second period, we saw Carter Verhaeghe sort of cut back door against the Rangers, given the numbers. The puck had been popped up, and he was able to sort of almost baseball bat sort of swing it back into the net. So that was their first goal of the night. And then in overtime, just a minute into the overtime period, Blake Wheeler, who was playing in his first game since mid-February, he did get a hooking call. This was super unfortunate for Wheeler, who suffered a really significant leg injury that was thought to potentially be career threatening, and he ends up coming back, and obviously he is the one who ends up sitting in the penalty box as his team gets walked off. Now, it's hard to blame Wheeler himself, and Fox defended him during the post-game, talking about the fact that he was put in a tough position thanks to the fact that Mika Zibanejad had put the Rangers in a little bit of a compromising position with his turnover at mid-ice that allowed for Alexander Barkov to get a fast break opportunity. And I think that Wheeler, he gets the hooking penalty. It very easily could have been a penalty shot. They sort of glazed over it, I feel like, a little bit in the broadcasting room there, but you know, on that breakaway, definitely could have been a shot, and Alexander Barkov, one of the best shootout players in the NHL. Now, it would have been fascinating, that matchup between him and Igor Shesterkin, having that sort of one-on-one. It would have been an absolutely massive moment, and could have been, you know, if Shesterkin was able to make a save, a huge momentum boost for the Rangers here, where they were getting outplayed, I thought, down the stretch of this game, especially late in that third period. But, you know, I think that either way, it would have been interesting from that perspective, you know, whether or not Rangers fans in particular, obviously looking at it retroactively here, but whether they would have wanted to put the, you know, puck in the hands of Shesterkin, essentially, or at least the game's balance in his hands. But the Panthers end up going up on the power play, and then it was very quick from there, where they end up winning the face-off, and just sort of a bunch of quick passes ends up setting Sam Reinhart up in the slot, where, you know, the best one of the best players you can possibly have taking shots on the power play. Now 31 power play goals since the beginning of the regular season, just on an absolute heater in terms of capitalizing in those moments, and he did so yet again. Definitely not the man that if you're the Rangers you want to let go unchecked in a moment like that. But a really tough position either way how the refs called it for Igor Shesterkin, who put together another really incredible game. He's been standing on his head just about all series, it feels like, since the start of game 2, really. I mean, allowed 3 goals in game 1, but even then, felt like the Panthers attack, that is, was pretty all over him from the start of that one as well. But, last night faces 40 shots and made 37 saves. The Sam Bennett goal in the second period is probably the one that he wishes he had back, where it was almost a little bit reminiscent of the goal from Robertson facing off against the Oilers the other night, where in the third period he had just sort of stuffed it behind Stuart Skinner and that ended up being, the goal that carried them throughout the rest of the game. In this situation in the second period, not quite as big of a moment necessarily, but one where, Bennett was able to just sort of stuff it in that small opening that was on the left post, right post from his perspective, and ends up bouncing off the back of his skate and into the net. Quick side note here on ESPN's intermission reports. I have really enjoyed them up to this point. I think that PK Subban is massively entertaining, and, as a Bruins fan, I feel like I was sort of, as I was growing up, I was taught to dislike PK Subban, which is probably fair to some degree, but I think his analysis is very entertaining, and it's been funny seeing the way that he is sort of almost spewing over Shesterkin's play, which is for good reason. The Rangers are definitely down in this series if it isn't for his play, but Subban's been sort of all over him, and the back and forth a little bit last night between him and Steve Levy was just really funny to me, where Levy was pushing back a little bit. He was also agreeing, obviously, with how great Shesterkin's been, but he did make the comparison a little bit in regards to that Sam Bennett goal, that if Skinner allowed something like that, he would face more backlash for it, which is definitely true, but also with how good Shesterkin's been, the lack of criticism is justified. But I just think the exchanges between Subban and Levy, and obviously having Messier in there, who has been, just so knowledgeable, that I think that ESPN, I'm not a huge fan of necessarily all of the majority, frankly, of some of these halftime reports, and this is ESPN and beyond, but I think that the NHL's network there is one of the best in the business, and I have a really fun time watching it. But some other quick notes here on this game. I mentioned Zibanejad's turnover in overtime. It's been a rough start to the series for him up to this point, where he is yet to net a goal or get an assist. Has not scored a point after getting at least 1 point in 10 of the team's first 11 postseason games. And he had a great opportunity, I believe it was in the second period, where he got a fast break opportunity off of a Chris Kreider pass, but shot it high and wide. That one didn't go. The Rangers are just going to need more production from him, I should say. And to be fair, he got that breakaway opportunity, but the Panthers definitely aren't making it easy either, where their forecheck just continues to dominate. We saw this going back to the Bruins series as well, where the Panthers were really ramping it up. I thought that, I believe that last night was the third time in this 4-game series up to this point where the Rangers were held without a shot on net for a stretch of at least 10 minutes. Definitely fact check me on that if I'm off base there, but I don't believe that I am. But the Panthers are out shooting the Rangers 77-46 in these last 2 games, which does sort of further go on to prove how important Shesterkin's been for them. And like I mentioned, late in that third period, the Rangers just could not get it out of the zone, and the Panthers were just sort of peppering Shesterkin with different shots there, and almost looked like it wasn't going to go to overtime. But, ultimately, the Panthers even this one up. Series is 2-2. That feels like the series is at the right spot as well, where you can definitely make an argument that the Panthers could be up in this, and they definitely feel like they outplayed the Rangers in at least Game 3, possibly even Game 2 as well. But the play of Shesterkin's just been so dominant that we have an even series here, and I hope this one goes 7 because it has been massively entertaining. But let me know what your thoughts are on this series. We are going to be shifting gears here, though, to the NFL, where we're going to be closing out the show today. Have a couple segments here. Going to briefly touch on the Houston Texans signing wide receiver Nico Collins to a new contract extension. We'll give you the details on that. Sort of look ahead for the season here of the Texans, who have a lot of high expectations. And then finally, we're going to be ending off the show. I want to take a very early look here at some of the NFL awards that are coming up for this season, and sort of looking at the top candidates for Rookie of the Year awards, Offensive Player of the Year, Defensive Player of the Year, and MVP. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Going to be finishing off our show here with some NFL talk, starting with the breaking news that the Texans have signed Nico Collins to a 3-year contract extension worth about $72.5 million, $75 million actually, $52 million guaranteed with a chance to make up to $75 million. Nico Collins had a breakout year last season for the Texans. 1,297 yards, 80 receptions, and 8 touchdowns. Career highs in each category, and top 23 in the league in each category. And, to some degree, sort of came out of nowhere. He was a third-round pick in 2021 and was very quiet to begin his NFL career. That being said, was playing with, I would say, some subpar quarterback play. Davis Mills had maybe a couple moments in there, but it was clear the Texans were without a true franchise quarterback. And Nico Collins, something about his development over the course of his first couple of years, he was just the ultimate safety blanket, it felt like, for CJ Stroud this past season, where Collins isn't necessarily this extremely high-end athlete that is going to burn defenders on a regular basis necessarily, but he is just incredibly reliable and was massive for Stroud and the Texans on third down conversions and in the red zone, where he had some really impressive red zone stats. And again, keep in mind, it's not like he's this overwhelming athlete with tremendous size. Now, he's 6'4", so he's definitely not small by any means, but 215 pounds. It's not like he's just going up over the top of these defenders, but his route running is just so tremendous, and his anticipation as well. And he developed a really good rapport with CJ Stroud at a time where Stroud needed to have a go-to guy. And 6 of Collins' 8 touchdowns this season came in the red zone. He caught over half of Stroud's red zone touchdown passes, 8 of his 15. So, Nico Collins was an extremely impactful player here for the Texans, being in the position where they currently are, where he was able to help, grow CJ Stroud. And Stroud, obviously, I mean, give him his credit as well, because he's the one that is this tremendous talent that seems like he is going to be leading the Texans to successful years for the time to come. But being able to have somebody he really trusted. Now, obviously, keep in mind, there were other options on that offense as well, such as Tank Dell, and they also brought in Dalton Schultz last offseason, who was another very successful option for the Texans, especially when it comes to those red zone possessions. But, Collins rightfully gets paid in this situation where he was coming up on an expiring contract, and he's now going to be paid through the next few years. Another example of the Texans taking advantage of the fact that they are going to have potentially a top 10 quarterback in the league on a rookie contract in CJ Stroud for years to come here. So super encouraging stuff from the Texans altogether. We've talked at length about their offseason, over the course of the year. Stephon Diggs is the big name guy that they brought in, but I liked a lot of their defensive additions as well. And it seems like they're going to be in a really good position to contend once again, where they won 10 games last year. Now, I do think that their division is going to be slightly better. I am expecting a Jaguars bounce-back season. I know that some people are not necessarily fully on that same boat with me. Got some comments on a video I did last week about how bad Trevor Lawrence is. I'm not necessarily ready to go quite that far. Listen, I'm frustrated with Lawrence as well to some degree in terms of whether or not they are going to necessarily ever see the full version of Trevor Lawrence that we were expecting when, as he was coming into the NFL, he was seen as the best quarterback prospect since Andrew Luck. He was a prolific winner at college, and the love for him is definitely warranted, but we haven't necessarily seen the consistency for him just yet. And as much as I disagree with the take that we got about the fact that Trevor Lawrence is absolutely trash, I do think that we are sort of basing him off of a 9-win season in which he won a playoff game that took one of the biggest collapses, and playing the Chargers, who are sort of known for, especially during the Staley era. I can't believe Staley wasn't fired after that game in particular, but that's a whole different conversation. But the majority of his stock is sort of going into this one playoff game. And that being said, I thought he showed a lot of flashes with some of the late game comebacks that he had against the Ravens and the Cowboys as well. And he was sort of masterful in that second half. He was a disaster in the first half, though. I think he threw 3 interceptions. But going off a little bit on a Jaguars tangent here, just on the note of that division, the Colts could definitely be better as well, but the Texans are shaping into a real contender, as we have Christopher Shepard in the comment section saying, huge for Houston, wouldn't be surprised if they made a Super Bowl run. Absolutely. And some of the sports books sort of back that up as well. And again, we're going to very shortly here be getting into some of the NFL awards for next season as well. But one thing I sort of wanted to highlight, CJ Stroud tied for top 3 in MVP odds, and the Texans, if you want to look at the Super Bowl odds, they are 7th, which, all things considered, a massive step forward from where we thought they could have been entering last season, where they had the number 2 overall pick for a reason, and they end up sort of turning that and making a trade, giving up their 2023 draft pick, which could have been an extremely risky move if CJ Stroud didn't develop into what he was. That could have been a top pick, but instead they turned that into CJ Stroud and Will Anderson, the offensive rookie and defensive rookies of the year. So Texans are absolutely in position to potentially make a Super Bowl run. Now, obviously, the AFC is loaded in front of them as well. You still have to deal with Mahomes and Burrow and Allen, and whether or not you have concerns with, some of the other parts of that roster, it's a lot of very elite quarterback play that you have in the conference. And CJ Stroud, in his upcoming second season, we're going to see whether or not he has what it takes to be able to overcome some of these obstacles that will be in his way. Very briefly mentioned it, but, with the Colts as well, not to the level of Mahomes, Burrow, Allen or anything, but, in his own division now, we're seeing this AFC South sort of build themselves up, where you have Anthony Richardson, who looked really promising in the first few weeks before dealing with injury. Trevor Lawrence, we just talked about at length. Will Levis is somebody that I think I like more than the average NFL fan, but, is somebody that at least is interesting. And Titans, I have a really hard time sort of figuring out what they're going to be for next season. But, ultimately, I think this was sort of a no-brainer move for the Texans, where Nico Collins just feels like, and especially at his age as well, where you're not worried about any type of a fall-off, you would think. He just turned 25 years old a couple months ago, that he, throughout this contract, is going to be just a real, solidifying factor with this team. I don't expect Stephon Diggs to be a long-term option for Houston, and there's, a lot sort of going on here as they have invested so much into this season. But Nico Collins, it just feels like to me throughout the duration of this contract, he's going to be an extremely reliable target for CJ Stroud, and I'm really excited to see what they are building here, because I really like D'Amico Ryans as a coach as well, and I think that there's a lot of upside with this team. But give us your thoughts in the comments section. Just talked sort of briefly there about the fact that CJ Stroud is potentially in the MVP conversation for next year. So we are going to be taking our final break of the show here. When we come back on the other side, I want to just sort of take an early look ahead at some of the odds and favorites for each of the major NFL honors. So stick with us, and we will be right back after this quick break. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're headed into our final segment of the day, where I want to sort of take a quick look ahead here at some of the top candidates for these major NFL honors headed into next season. So without further ado here, and by the way, in the comment section, absolutely let us know your takes on some of these names. We're going to be doing maybe a little bit of a quick run through in some of these instances. I'd be happy to touch on any particular player that you guys have for this upcoming season, but I want to start with Offensive Rookie of the Year, where Caleb Williams is the overwhelming favorite to win this award, and for good reason. With the amount of love that he has gotten sort of as a prospect headed up to this point, it's really no surprise that, he, the individual player, would be the favorite for this. But then you also take into consideration the situation that he's walking into, where he has all of these weapons around him. DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, they go out and they draft Rome Odunze, a very deep running back room as well, and outside of maybe a little bit of questions surrounding the offensive line, I think that Caleb Williams has all of the pieces around him to succeed. And again, I'm not necessarily guaranteeing anything here, but I do look at the rookie season that CJ Stroud just had, and I love CJ Stroud. We just sort of went on about him in the last segment as well, but I think that Caleb Williams could very likely have a comparable season to what CJ Stroud just put out there with a Texans team that has talent, no doubt, but not to the level of what Chicago has headed into next season. And listen, I know that a lot of people are not in on Caleb Williams based off of some types of personality stuff, and he's definitely, a face of this upcoming generation of quarterbacks in terms of the way that he sort of handles his business with some things, but I think that the talent's absolutely there. Now, I guess there is definitely a concern with him in terms of, is he going to be necessarily mature enough in the pocket to make the right plays, not hold on to the ball too long, especially if that offensive line is collapsing a little bit. Is he going to be able to sort of take advantage of having all of these weapons around him? But I do believe in what the Bears have built up around him. We've gone back and sort of looked into it in the past. I think that this is quite possibly the best situation a first-round quarterback has walked into since the beginning of the 21st century, at least, is where I sort of went back and looked at the research of it. But some of the other candidates here as well, of course, Jane Daniels, the number 2 overall pick in Washington, and there are some receivers there that sort of don't get quite as much love as they probably should in Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson. Dotson especially, I feel like, is one of the more underrated wide receivers in the NFL. The Commanders went out and made a bunch of different moves trying to bolster their offensive line a little bit, starting with the center position where they went out and got Tyler Biadasz. They brought in a running back as well as Eckler, who I know that he's not the prime version of himself, but I do think can sort of play well in the passing game alongside Brian Robinson. So there are different, options there at for Daniels to sort of play with in this upcoming season. Third longest odds are Marvin Harrison Jr. Should be really interesting to see with him, where he seems very league ready, and he has a quarterback that hasn't necessarily had this level. Obviously, DeAndre Hopkins was special for a bit there with Kyler Murray, but definitely a little bit of an older version, and Marvin Harrison Jr. I think has a very high ceiling. So ultimately, I do think this award is going to be going to Caleb Williams, and that's where my money would be. But as we know, a lot of the times these don't necessarily perfectly play out how we believe. Now, I think it's probably going to be a quarterback is the reality of the situation. Now, CJ Stroud, again, I'm not saying he wasn't deserving of it by any means. Puka Nacua absolutely had a nice case for it as well. But if Puka isn't going to win it last year, I sort of find it hard to believe unless all of the quarterbacks, all of the 6 that were drafted in the first round, are unsuccessful this season. I would imagine it's probably going to be going to a quarterback. J.J. McCarthy, by the way, 4th in odds according to DraftKings. But Defensive Rookie of the Year, this one, I went back and did a little bit of sort of research around the history of the award because I was curious, how they typically value the different positions in these instances. And if you want to go back the past decade, we have seen 6 sort of, interior rusher, or not interior necessarily, but frontline rushers, and I included Micah Parsons in that list because especially in his rookie season, what he was sort of doing best was being an edge rusher for them. So 6 linemen if you want to include Parsons there. If you want to throw him into the linebacker category, him and Shaq Leonard are the only 2 linebackers to win the award in the past decade. And then we've seen 3 corners win it in the past decade: Sauce Gardner, Marshawn Lattimore, and Marcus Peters. Which the interesting part about this is the fact that before Peters won it in 2015, the last cornerback to win Defensive Rookie of the Year was actually Charles Woodson in 1998, one of my favorite players in NFL history. But I think that does sort of go to show the development of how we sort of view these positions in the NFL. The majority of the 2000s, especially early on and into the early 2010s, was dominated by linebackers. The, classic middle linebacker who is stuffing the run and being the on-the-field general isn't necessarily quite as valued in today's NFL. So the top candidates for this are edge rushers and they are cornerbacks, where you look, Dallas Turner is the favorite as things currently stand. Laiatu Latu follows him up along with Quinion Mitchell. And then if you go down the list here, now granted, linebackers obviously in this year's draft weren't quite as successful, or I wouldn't say successful, but there weren't really seen to be quite as many top-end options from a linebacker perspective. Edgerrin Cooper, who was the first linebacker taken off the board, and it was the second or third round, sort of blending in here at this point, but I believe he is sitting at the 12th best odds. So we're going to see an edge rusher or a cornerback. Now, I think that if Laiatu Latu stays healthy, he is in prime position to take this award. It does interest me with Dallas Turner, where they went out and they brought in a number of different players as well, especially in that defensive front, that there are going to be some bodies potentially taking away from overall sack production with him. But I mean, Dallas Turner was the number one. No, he was not. Latu was the number one defensive end that was taken off the board, but Dallas Turner was seen as sort of the highest upside coming into the draft. Again, I think that Latu, the concern with him is health, but he is an absolute dog, so that would probably be my pick at this point. But I would also be a little curious, at least on DraftKings right now. Chop Robinson is 6th in odds at plus 1,300, was drafted in by the Dolphins late in the first round. He's somebody where, as long as that, athleticism translates, which I expect him to, can he develop sort of the more technical skills from a defensive line perspective? I think that he can definitely win this award as well. Offensive Player of the Year, it's the usual suspects here, where Tyreek Hill, Christian McCaffrey, CeeDee Lamb, these are the types of names that we're looking at. I think that if Tyreek Hill stays healthy, he has a real chance to win this. Now, he did last year as well, and you can make a very similar case for Christian McCaffrey, who ultimately did come home with the award, and I think had a better case for MVP than a lot of people were sort of projecting. Knock on wood that Christian McCaffrey stays healthy. I do feel like Tyreek is the better injury bet. This is an award that I wouldn't put any amount of money on in particular, but I do think that really those top two are where things get interesting. If you are looking for a little bit of a long shot and you believe in J.J. McCarthy, I mean, there's a chance you could sort of pair him up with Justin Jefferson. Jefferson is at plus 1,500 odds according to DraftKings to win this award. I expect a big year out of him. Is J.J. McCarthy going to be the player to get the ball to him enough is the question. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section. Defensive Player of the Year. Again, a lot of the usual characters for this award, as we have this just unbelievable collection of defensive end talent in the NFL, where the top 5 are all just like, the fact that we have Myles Garrett, who won Defensive Player of the Year last year, he's 5th on this list, just goes to show the depth of talent at the defensive end position. TJ Watt is the front runner, followed by Micah Parsons. Nick Bosa and Max Crosby are tied for 3rd, and then it's Myles Garrett. Feels like it's going to have to be one of those players, each and every one of them a dominant force up front. I think I would probably lean TJ Watt. There was a huge argument for him last year. Obviously, that's where the debates around pass rush win rate and all of that, how much should that be taken into account. But I think that maybe, you know, as long as he has another impactful season like he does, I don't want to say a complete correction, but I think that voters probably come back around to TJ Watt considering how dominant he is. And we've seen the difference of that Steelers defense when he is on and off the field. But finally here, MVP, like we sort of talked about before the break, CJ Stroud in the top 3 for MVP odds. It's Patrick Mahomes, it's Josh Allen, and then it is Stroud and Burrow, followed behind by Lamar Jackson at plus 1,000 as well to try and repeat as the MVP in this coming season. Some very interesting names following up that as well, where Jordan Love and Brock Purdy are plus 1,200 as well. I don't know about either one of those, but we do know the history of this award is, I think it's something like 13 or 14 of the past 15 years, the MVP award has been given to a player that is on a team with a top 2 record in their conference. So team success is everything in terms of this, which is why, again, I love CJ Stroud, and I'm really excited for his future. But do we think that the Texans are going to be a top 2 team in the AFC? Now, I'm not saying it's completely unrealistic, and it could definitely be on the table. But that's a bet I just don't know if I'm willing to take. Again, let me know if you feel differently in the comment section. But you know, you can make a case as well. The Bills definitely got worse from last season to this year with a lot of their departures. I do feel like overall some people are sort of overrating their losses, and I do think that the Bills, I mean, they ended up as the 2 seed despite having what felt like a really bad regular season last year, and they ended up locking down that 2 seed. Ultimately here, I think Josh Allen is probably where I would lean. I expect him to still remain putting up big stats without Stephon Diggs. I've talked about this on the show before. I actually felt like where Josh Allen struggled at times when he was trying to force feed Stephon Diggs a little bit more, and down the second half of the season he just sort of abandoned that, and I thought that that's when the Bills offense really started getting more methodical and playing at a higher level. So I think that Josh Allen, also understanding that there is this sort of exterior narrative that is going to be surrounding them a little bit in terms of, can Josh Allen prove himself without Stephon Diggs? I do believe he can. And I think that some of the injuries that they'll be returning from, specifically on the defensive side of the ball, is going to help for them. But, you know, very obviously early ahead of the NFL season to be running through all of this, but I was curious where sort of Vegas was at this point. But let me know your picks for MVP and all of these awards in the comments section. But that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Be sure to follow us on social media as well for more exclusive short content. We stream here live, at least our show, every 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. Be sure to check out our other shows as well, though. We got the baseball podcast coming on next with Sam Menzie very shortly. But we will be back tomorrow afternoon. We will see you then. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet.